they've not. Who made them? Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
It's not there with the YouTube video. It's supposed to be easy.
Yeah.
No? Not with ours anyway, put it that way, we're not that gifted.
You got there in the end.
Oh, I was close enough. I feel a little bit.
Oh, I think you would have known that was a palm. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Well, it's good to see everyone. It's a bit of a dreich night, but lovely to welcome everyone. And tonight we're going to hear the second part, really, of Nathan's ruminations on Tolkien. We heard about spirituality in Tolkien in November, and tonight it's going to be Tolkien and the Hope of Easter. So welcome to the talk. Just to say what's going to happen. So we've got lovely cake and eats for afterwards. So the talk will last around about 35 minutes to 40 minutes. And then we'll have a time of questions. And then we're going to go through and have some refreshments. So I hope you can stay for the refreshments as well. So I'll just pass over to Nathan.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. It is a real privilege and a pleasure to return to speak about something very dear to my heart, something that I love very much, which is Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. This was a trilogy of fantasy books published between 1954 and 1955. And for those of you who aren't so familiar with the story, I'll give a very brief synopsis. Our main character is Frodo Baggins. Now, he's a hobbit. He's like a human being, but about 3 foot tall. And he lives in the Shire, which think of English traditional rural countryside. He inherits a magical ring, which can turn you invisible when you wear it. But it turns out that this ring was made by the Dark Lord, Sauron. And Sauron wants this ring back, because if he's able to get the ring, he will have the power to take over the whole of Middle-earth. That's the name of this world. He will be able to destroy his enemies and to enslave anyone who's left. Frodo's not able to hide the ring from Sauron forever. He's also not able to stop Sauron from taking it off him. So the only way that he can deal with this is by destroying it. To do this, he must go to Mount Doom, which is a volcano in the heart of Sauron's land. And so Frodo, with a bunch of wonderful characters such as the wizard Gandalf, must go on a quest from the very west of Middle-earth to the very east to Sauron's land. And that's what the trilogy really focuses on. Last time, we looked at the ways Tolkien's Catholic faith influenced his writing of The Lord of the Rings, how certain characters had Christ-like aspects, such as Frodo, Aragorn, and Gandalf. We also saw how important themes in Christianity, such as forgiveness and mercy, made their way as important parts of The Lord of the Rings. This time I want to go a bit deeper. I want to go to something which I think is at the very heart of the tale. I think that Tolkien thought that mythology that was developed in Northern Europe and the story of Easter were highly significant. They both addressed in different ways the major aspects and problems that we as human beings face. And this conviction influenced at a fundamental level the structure of the Lord of the Rings stories. It also undergirds important values that the Lord of the Rings champions, such as courage and hope. And in turn, it also influences our experiences as reader, the kind of emotional journey that we might go on as well. Now, this conclusion might not be immediately evident from a casual reading of the text. There is, for example, no organized religion in Middle-earth, which is quite a surprising thing at first when you consider Tolkien was a Catholic. There's no explicit reference to God. And whereas in the Chronicles of Narnia, there's a very clear Jesus parallel in terms of Aslan, there is no clear parallel to Jesus in the characters of The Lord of the Rings. There's nobody who's a direct one-to-one. However, I think if we look at a couple of lectures that Tolkien gave back in the 1930s, we'll be able to see these themes more clearly in The Lord of the Rings. One delivered in 1936 on the poem Beowulf will key us into his ideas about northern mythology, while his lecture in 1939 on fairy stories will help us see more clearly the role of Easter. Although these two lectures take place about 20 years before the publication of The Lord of the Rings, they do come at the time when The Hobbit was first published in 1937, and Tolkien began writing The Lord of the Rings at this point. While they don't explicitly connect northern mythology with Easter, I think actually what we see, and I hope to show as we go through this talk, is that The Lord of the Rings brings the ideas of these two lectures together, and Tolkien kind of integrates northern pagan mythology with the Christian belief in Easter. So, with that said, let us turn first then to Tolkien's lecture on Beowulf. Beowulf is an Anglo-Saxon epic poem, and it's probably one of the most important, if not the most important, literary product of the Old English world. There's some debate about when exactly it was written. Some scholars, and Tolkien would be in this camp, would say that it was written in either the 8th or 9th centuries, whereas others go a bit later to the 10th or 11th. Either way, it was clearly written by an Anglo-Saxon, and the author was also a Christian, although one of the things we find with Anglo-Saxon poetry is that it's a blend of pagan and Christian themes. It had a very profound influence upon Tolkien. We can divide the poem into two parts. The first half deals with the monster Grendel. Grendel is a man-eating giant who has attacked the Hall of the Danes. The king cannot sleep in there at night, for he fears that Grendel will come and take away one of his warriors. Beowulf is a mighty young man who seeks glory and fame and riches. And so he travels across the sea and, in unarmed combat, wrestles and slays the monster Grendel. The second half is set many years later, when Beowulf has become king of his own tribe, that of the Geats. A dragon has made its home nearby in a burial mound with a great hoard of gold and many jewels. A thief comes by and steals a cup, and in retaliation, the dragon wreaks vengeance upon the local countryside and attacks the Geatish home. As their defender, Beowulf goes forth to confront the dragon. Though he is able to slay it, he is mortally wounded in the process, and the future of the Geats is left somewhat in doubt. Incidentally, we can see a number of parallels with the Hobbit story, for those of you who know it. When the dwarves and Bilbo reach the Lonely Mountain, the Hobbit is sent in, and he sees there the dragon Smaug atop a great pile of gold, and he steals, what does he steal? A cup. When he steals this cup, Smaug is enraged, and he goes out to attack the local lake town. Now, in the lecture that Tolkien was giving, he was trying to respond to critics at the time about an issue which was quite important in early 20th century Beowulf studies. Many scholars thought that the poem's focus on monsters, that it was primarily about a conflict between Beowulf and a giant and a dragon, devalued its worth. They believed that it would have more literary merit if it focused on historical events and maybe raised them up to a higher level. So, for example, Beowulf mentions, and it has an anecdote about a conflict between the real king Hygelac or Hygelac and the Franks. They would say that should be the heart of the poem, not this stuff about dragons and giants. And in so doing, some scholars would say it would be more like the Iliad. Tolkien wants to defend the centrality of monsters in the poem. He says that actually it's integral to why it is so important and why it is so good. We might also infer from his defense, as we'll see going forward, that that's why he writes stories with monsters in them as well. So to do this, Tolkien starts looking at Norse mythology. Now we might wonder, why would he look at Norse mythology when this is an Anglo-Saxon poem? Well, unfortunately, there is very little documentary evidence about the pre-Christian beliefs about religion and mythology of the Anglo-Saxons. However, we do know that they are descended from Germanic peoples who, in the 4th century, migrated from Germany and Lower Scandinavia to England after the collapse of the Roman presence within England. It stands to reason, then, that they would have shared many of the stories, many of the myths and legends that we find in Germanic and Norse mythology. And we have a good deal of evidence about these traditions. Even more the case, though, is that we find, even in Beowulf, which is a Christian poem, many of the values that are in that translate or have a kind of synergy with those that we find in the Norse traditions. And so Tolkien characterizes this, or names this more broadly, the Northern imagination. That's what he wants to explore. At the very heart of this Northern imagination is the idea that reality consists in a conflict between two sides. We might call this a dualistic picture of the world. We have Odin, king of Asgard, who rules over the gods. He has created the moral order and the cosmos. All of civilization is upheld by his rule. On the fringes, on the boundaries outside of his realm, are the Jotnar, the giants, and the monsters, such as Jorgmandr, the world serpent who's so big he can encircle the world. And we have a nice picture of him here. These two sides, the gods and the giants, are in perpetual conflict. To help them in this struggle, the gods draw to them the mighty heroes of humanity. Odin or the Valkyrie, these are his emissaries. They will appear to a mighty warrior in battle, and this will be the sign that they are about to die. But as they are killed in the conflict, rather than going to Helheim, which is where most people will go in the afterlife, they are taken to Valhalla, the resting place of Odin. This is a great hall on top of what's called the Glittering Mountain. And there they will become the Einherjar. They will be soldiers who feast and drink and train to fight the giants and monsters on behalf of Odin and the gods. What emerges from this kind of picture of the world is a sense in which that there are a few places which are safe and secure. Valhalla being the archetype, but also think of your great Saxon hall, or in Rohan, the great hall of Edoras. These are places where there is safety and comfort, but these are surrounded by a threatening sea, a hostile world filled with wild places populated by goblins and such other beings. The forests are filled with fairies who will entrap us and ensnare us with their magic. The mountains are the homes of the great giants who eat us, such as Grendel, while the sea, the symbol of chaos, is filled with monsters like Jorgmandr. The Lord of the Rings also has this kind of world. The hobbits live in the relative safety and security of the Shire. They have very little knowledge of the outside world, and they feel rather safe. However, when Frodo and his three friends leave the safety of Buckland, they enter into the Old Forest, and they're in for a rude awakening. As they travel in, they are attacked by a mighty tree, Old Man Willow. He sucks within his roots 2 of the hobbits. They learn very quickly that parts of nature are hostile. As they go further on their journey, they discover that the roads are patrolled by orcs and goblins. Wolves are hunting them, trolls want to eat them, and terrible dark enemies pursue them, such as the ringwraiths. This world, which is very dangerous, only has a few outposts of safety, such as Rivendell or Lothlorien. Think of them as being surrounded on all sides, but within they are safe. Tied in with this idea that the world is made up of a conflict between 2 sides is another conviction in the northern imagination. This is like the idea that the gods face unavoidable defeat. They will be beaten by the monsters and the giants. And this is fated, it's prophesied, they cannot change this reality. This is going to take place at Ragnarok, which means the twilight of the gods. The first sign of this will be Fimbulwinter. This will be 3 winters in a row without summer. Think of in The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, you have the White Witch's rule, and it's perpetual winter. The sun, moon, and stars will disappear. And there will be earthquakes, mighty earthquakes all over the world. Mountains will be lowered and valleys will be raised up. Then the great fire giant Surtur will lead the Jotnar and the monsters against the gods in a final climactic battle. Fenrir the wolf, who we can see here, will devour Odin. Though Thor will kill the world serpent Jörmungandr, he will be poisoned in the process, mortally so. All the gods and all the Einherjar, the mighty heroes of humanity, will be slain. Then Surtur will envelop Valhalla, that place of safety and security, in fire, and then the whole world. All the old order which Odin upheld will be overturned and gone forever. We see this idea that everything ultimately ends in doom expressed at various points within The Lord of the Rings. Our characters are often placed in situations where it seems like there is no hope of victory. One example can be seen when the hobbits go past the Barrow Downs. Having escaped the clutches of Old Man Willow, they first get to stay at the sanctuary of Tom Bombadil, a larger-than-life character who provides comfort and relief from their journey. However, before long, they must be on their way to the village of Bree, where they are going to meet the wizard Gandalf. They must pass on their way the Barrows. These are old burial mounds where ancient kings long forgotten are buried. Rumor has it that they are now haunted, that they have come back as ghosts or Barrow Wights. As the hobbits go on their way, they are enveloped by mist. They lose sight and touch of one another and finally succumb to the spells of the Barrow Wights. Frodo is the only one to wake up. He finds himself within one of these barrows, and he sees his friends lying there. They are completely in white, with crowns on their heads, and they're completely comatose. He then hears a sickening, horrible song. Cold be hand and heart and bone, and cold be sleep under stone. Never more to wake on stony bed, never till sun fails and moon is dead. In the black wind the stars shall die, and still on gold here let them lie. till the Dark Lord lifts his hand over dead sea and withered land. So we see here a prophecy, as it were, that everything's going to end in doom and darkness. And I think this episode really illustrates why Tolkien thought that monsters were an important literary device, at least in the poem Beowulf. If the poem had focused on a historical conflict, let's say the Battle of Bannockburn, well, this would be then a political conflict, a conflict of human rivals. Our interest in it, or its significance for us, might depend upon which side we had most association with. So if we are English or Scottish, we might have a certain partisan view of the Battle of Bannockburn. To put it another way, the enemy in the conflict is dependent on a political association. By contrast, a monster is an enemy of all people. Grendel is not just a threat to the Danes. He will also attack the Swedes or the Geats. The Barrowites are not just a threat to Frodo, but to anybody who passes that way. This means for Tolkien that monsters are a symbol for something which is universal, something which affects all human beings, the whole human species. These would be suffering, death, the ravages of time. Overall, what Tolkien will label the long defeat. In the 19th century and early 20th century, figures like Prince Albert argued that advances in technology with the Industrial Revolution, the dissemination of education, the capitalist system, the raising of rights for many people was leading for folks to live longer, more comfortable lives. And there was a real confidence that if things kept going on that trajectory, we could reach a kind of utopian existence. Albert, in one of his speeches, even talks about this being the way in which the kingdom of God will become present upon earth. But I think Tolkien shared a conviction with the northern imagination or culture we've been looking at, that this isn't the case, that often things do come to an end, and there's very little we can do about it. We all face suffering of many different kinds. We can try to resist it for so long, but it always reaches us. And indeed, it doesn't matter how good you are, how strong, intelligent, rich, powerful, or famous, we all face death. Tolkien was fully aware of this, having fought in World War I. The shell is an indiscriminate mode of killing. Moreover, institutions and indeed civilizations don't last forever. Things don't always get better. Sometimes they decline. Indeed, everything seems to decline, and everything has its end time. Perhaps the scouring of the Shire is a good example of this, that the place of safety, the place of security, which throughout the story we've always thought of fondly, it's always been that place that we want to go back to. When the hobbits return from their quest, they discover that it's been ravaged by evil forces. The thugs of the wizard Saruman have enslaved the hobbits. They've made them work terrible hours and in terrible conditions. They're cutting down trees and burning them out of malice. They're polluting the air and the water. They're constructing horrible buildings. The safe place, the refuge that we thought was impervious to evil, has been corrupted too. And though the hobbits are able to push back this evil and renew the Shire, there is a lesson there that in this life, we're never going to finally defeat evil. It always comes back in some form or another. Tolkien argued that in the northern imagination, the proper response to this impending doom was not despair. It was not to give up. Rather, it was what he called northern courage or northern heroic spirit. And we can kind of see this in Ragnarok. Here we have Odin riding towards Fenrir. He is fated to die. There's nothing he can do about it, but nonetheless, he charges at him defiantly. Tolkien said this idea was best expressed in another Anglo-Saxon poem, The Battle of Maldon, which was written in around 911, I think. It's based on a historical battle where the Saxons were surrounded by Viking warriors, and they were all about to be slaughtered. The poem then pipes up. An old warrior called Beowulf declares, "Our hearts must grow resolute, our courage more valiant. Our spirits must be greater, though our strength grows less." There is this idea that although defeat is inevitable, that we should stand fast. We should make a last stand for what we care about, what we love, what we believe in. That might be our family, our friends, our nation, an idea, indeed, religion itself. This shows the sincerity of what we stand for. And though these characters are defeated, that is not a refutation of the principles of why they fought. Thus, in northern cultures of this period, the greatest virtue was this sort of courage, while conversely, the greatest taboo was cowardice. We see this kind of heroic necessity in the scene with the Barrows. We read the following passage about Frodo. When he came to himself again, for a moment he recalled nothing except a sense of dread. Then suddenly he knew he was imprisoned, caught hopelessly. He was in a barrow. A Barrowite had taken him, and he was probably already under the dreadful spells of the Barrowites, about which whispered tales spoke. He dared not move, but lay as he found himself, flat on his back upon a cold stone with his hands on his breast. But though his fear was so great that it seemed to be part of the very darkness that was round him, he found himself as he lay thinking about Bilbo Baggins and his stories, of their jogging along together in the lanes of the Shire, and talking about roads and adventures. There is a seed of courage hidden, often deeply, it is true, in the heart of the fattest and most timid hobbit, waiting for some final and desperate danger to make it grow. Frodo was neither very fat nor very timid. Indeed, though he did not know it, Bilbo and Gandalf had thought him the best hobbit in the Shire. He thought he had come to the end of his adventure, and a terrible end, but the thought hardened him. He found himself stiffening, as if for a final spring. He no longer felt limp, like a helpless prey. The desperate situation arouses in Frodo an indomitable spirit. He chooses not to run away. He has this doubt that, well, if I put on the ring, I will go invisible, and thus I could escape. And it'll be explainable. People will think, no, that was the right thing to do. But this courage is there now, and he chooses to stay to defend his friends. After hearing that horrible song we heard a few moments ago, he sees an arm creeping round the corner towards one of the hobbits. It's one of the Barrowites. And plucking up his courage, he takes a sword nearby and hews off this arm. This is a pattern we see throughout The Lord of the Rings, people making a last stand in the most desperate situations when everything is futile. We might wonder, though, is that the end of things? Is the destiny of us all to go out in a blaze of glory, at least that being the best destiny? Well, let us turn now to the second lecture on fairy stories. In this talk, Tolkien was trying to describe the purpose and value of fantasy writings. He argued that the primary function of a good fairy story was to evoke the consolation of a happy ending. This had to follow a certain narrative structure. Our heroes had to be put in a situation where all seems lost, that evil is going to win, and thus it is a very dire predicament. They cannot get out of this themselves. Then there will be a sudden turn or change. Help, external help that was not looked for, arrives just in time. Defeat is overcome, and victory is secured. This is what Tolkien would call a good catastrophe, or a eucatastrophe, a sudden and miraculous grace not to be counted on happening again. And we see this with the Barrows situation. After Frodo has hacked off the arm, he remembers that if he says a certain set of words, then the character Tom Bombadil will come and rescue them. So he says these words, and this very mysterious character suddenly turns up. He sings a magical song, and the Barrowite is banished forever from the burial ground. He rescues the hobbits, gives them new clothes, returns to them their horses, and then accompanies them on the rest of the way through the country. We see this pattern in other places too. In the Battle of Helm's Deep, the men of Rohan are fighting the orcs of Saruman. They are driven back to the keep. Their numbers have been reduced drastically. It looks like they're all going to die. In a display of northern courage, King Theoden leads out his men for one final last charge, one final act of defiance. But just at that moment, they see on the horizon the wizard Gandalf, and he has brought with him more men to the fight. Together, they are able to overcome the orcs, and victory is clutched from the jaws of defeat. Importantly for Tolkien, these events within the story are not just the product of luck or chance. They are not just coincidences. Rather, we find characters like Gandalf and Elrond talking about these sorts of things as events which are meant to happen. We're told that there is some higher power at work in the world, working against evil for the good. And it seems to orchestrate events so that when things reach their pushing point, when things look like they're about to succumb to evil, then help arrives just in time. We might think, though, that, well, this is a fictional work, and while this might be true of Middle-earth, is this just a way to escape from reality? Are we just pretending that the world is like this, that there is this good force there, and it's just a way to cope with the unrelenting reality of suffering and death? Are we burying our heads in the sand from the truth? Well, in this lecture, Tolkien argues that good fantasy writing has the taste of reality. And this is why it resonates with us. It corresponds to something that we've experienced already, even if we didn't know it. And in the case of eucatastrophe, this narrative pattern, he would argue that it offers a glimpse of something which happened in history. This is the gospel, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, what he would describe as the myth-made fact or the myth-made history. He argues that the incarnation is the eucatastrophe of humanity. Our situation is dire. We are estranged from God due to sin, and there is no ability on our part to rectify this situation. The Son of God taking on a human nature uncorrupted by sin is the first step towards redemption, the first aid that was unlooked for. But the incarnation itself includes a eucatastrophe. Christ had been on a mission, proclaiming the gospel to communities in Israel. He had been telling them that the kingdom of God was at hand. He was healing the sick, driving out demons, and offering the fullness of life to those who would follow him. But to his disciples, it all seemed like things came to a rather drastic end at the crucifixion. All that goodness, all that promise of transformation had been seemingly defeated by evil and death. There was a hard point on it. However, that wasn't the end of the story. There was another catastrophe. What seemed like ultimate defeat was turned by the resurrection of Christ into the triumph of good. In turn, this meant that the emotions of the disciples were moved from despair to exhilaration and joy. Think of Mary Magdalene when she meets Jesus in the garden. And this pattern of eucatastrophe that we find in the Lord of the Rings is a kind of mirror onto this reality. It's pointing us towards this thing which has happened within history. So let's draw together some concluding thoughts. The Lord of the Rings takes seriously the reality of pain and suffering. It doesn't dismiss or diminish them. Many characters undergo these realities, some dying, such as Boromir and Theoden. And this is reflecting Tolkien's shared conviction with the Northern imagination that humanity faces by itself the long defeat, time and death. That often things get worse, and it often looks like evil's going to triumph. The Lord of the Rings also manifests Tolkien belief, shared with the Northern imagination, that the proper response to this is not despair or to give up, but courage, to make a last stand and to fight on, even when it seems futile, to do one's best. It isn't guaranteed to achieve this, but sometimes it becomes the context in which we receive a eucatastrophe. Tolkien believed that the resurrection showed that often when it reaches the point of ultimate defeat, God has overturned that and we see ultimate victory. And this is reflected in the pattern of the Lord of the Rings of a series of eucatastrophes, of our main characters such as Frodo receiving help that was unlooked for and ultimately arriving out of the situation triumphant. Thus we can see that Tolkien's ideas about Northern mythology and the importance of Easter influenced the way that the Lord of the Rings as a story is structured. We can also see that it impacts the emotional journey that we as readers and the characters in the stories go on. At points we are feeling sorrow, despair, tension, when all seems lost. But we are moved to joy, what Tolkien describes as joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief, that which makes our heart beat and moves us to tears. And finally, we can see that some of the values, or two of the important values that the story champions, are influenced by Tolkien's beliefs about Northern mythology and Easter. The story's elevation of courage reflects his shared convictions with Norse and Saxon literature. And the story's conviction that hope is something to hold on to is also reflective of his Christian faith. The Lord of the Rings reflects the reality that we can hope in the triumph of good over evil. Thank you for listening.
So we can have a few questions and a bit of discussion just now, and then we'll go through for something to eat. So does anyone have any questions that you would like to ask? I'll give you this way so that it's on the screen.
You talk about the northern mythology, the northern narrative. What does this say to English triumphalism versus Scottish nationalism?
It's an interesting question. I think, well, I think on the one hand that the northern mythological approach isn't a triumphalist message at all. It's one in which ultimately things end in doom. So, although there can be virtue in the courage in resisting that prospect, everything ends in defeat. In terms of how that relates to the English context then, I think I was kind of contrasting Tolkien's view, which is more in tune with this, with the what you might call the spirit of the British Empire, proclaimed by somebody like Prince Albert, which does have a triumphalist tone to it, which sees the British Empire as the instrument of God to bring about the kingdom of God on earth. Tolkien definitely doesn't share that conviction, and I think he roots that in this northern mythology. So I would make that kind of contrast. As to the Scottish context, I don't know enough about the mythology that features there to properly comment on that, but certainly there was Norse mythology with the Norse people when they arrived in Scotland in that place, but I don't know enough to comment fully on that.
Just two quick questions. First of all, Gandalf. What's your view, which I've read somewhere, about Gandalf being a Christ figure, that Gandalf the Grey, then he had his mishap with a monster, whose name I can't remember, and he came back as Gandalf the White, the Saviour. And the other question is with reference to the Lord of the Rings, really, it's an end of an age, isn't it, with the elves disappearing, etc. But you've got the Shire that's been corrupted, but then it's restored. Do you think there's any merit in comparing that with the new heaven and a new earth?
So to the first point about Gandalf, I think you're right that there are strong Christ parallels with Gandalf's story. He is this constant font of wisdom, but as you say, in the Mines of Moria, he has a fight with this demonic character, the Balrog, and although he slays the Balrog, he himself is mortally wounded. We might think of Beowulf in that context, actually, with the dragon. But then he is sent back, he is resurrected, you might say, as Gandalf the White, and he seems to have more powers than he did before as well, and that might parallel the risen Christ, who seems to be able to appear in different places and disappear at will, and so on. Within the story itself, though, Gandalf isn't the Christ figure, you might say, because he is a lesser angel who's been sent on this mission by higher angelic powers. He is a messenger with a very specific mission. He is not the agent who's going to redeem the whole world itself. And within some of Tolkien's manuscript writings, there's certain stories which talk about there being prophecies that the god of Middle-earth, Eru, will actually enter into Middle-earth at some point, become incarnate and redeem humanity. So I agree fully that Gandalf has certain Christ-like aspects, but within the story itself, he's not Christ, as it were. But yes, he definitely shares that. I think it's a great point to talk about the elves as at the end of the destruction of the ring, the elves leave Middle-earth forever, and this is one of the constant themes with the elves, is that these are immortal beings who have tasted perfection. They actually went to the Holy Land, or Valinor, where these angelic beings live, and they've become estranged from that. And in the world itself, they want to recreate that perfection. But because time and the ravages of time change everything, that what they want to achieve is impossible, and it's a constant case of decline and decline until we end up with them leaving completely. So this would kind of be the long defeat idea, again, being manifested in the story. But with the renewal of the Shire, you could definitely see it as a kind of mini restoration, or a pointing towards heaven and earth being brought together. Tolkien talks about this idea that initially you have the world being made in creation, and it has a perfection to it. Then it falls, what he would call Arda marred. It's marred by the fall of one of the chief angels, Melkor, who's a kind of satanic figure. But then, when the world's put right, it's not just going to go back to what it was like before, this kind of Garden of Eden situation. It's actually going to be something even better, Arda remade. And you do see that with the Shire. So there's a replanting of trees, but they're not just the trees that were there before. Sam has received from the Lady Galadriel a seed of one of the trees of Lothlorien, which are these magnificent, very beautiful, magical trees. And he plants that in the heart of the Shire. And so then its saplings start spreading. And so it elevates the Shire. We also see that the Shire becomes a much more serious, as a kind of political entity. It has a proper sense of itself as a country in relation to other countries. It has a proper defense force and government, and they even become interested in culture and history, founding libraries and so on. This, in the story again, is not going to be the end point, because we, again, in some of Tolkien's manuscript writings that were unpublished, there's going to be the return of the first Dark Lord, Melkor, or Morgoth, and things are going to decline once again until the final catastrophe of the Great Battle. But certainly you could see it as a kind of microcosm of what that might look like. So that was a long way of saying, yes, I fully agree with you.
Well, just to say thank you again on behalf of us all to Nathan, who I think has given us a bit more insight into the background of the Lord of the Ring, particularly in Norse mythology, which certainly I didn't know anything about or much about at all, so that's very illuminating. But also I think the spiritual strains that maybe we've been aware of intuitively, but maybe we needed brought out for us this evening, and I think Nathan's done that really well with the Easter theme that runs through Lord of the Rings. So we can be grateful for Nathan doing this for us tonight, and we should show our appreciation once again. So please do go through to the session room, and we'll have a cup of tea and a bit more time for conversation. Thank you.